Recording. And welcome. So we are thrilled to have our December Segal program convening, a chance for us to come together virtually as we focus on citizen leadership in between the times when we're able to come together in person. We feel very lucky to be joined today by State Representative Jay Kaufman, who's also a Segal founder, and he'll be talking to us about adaptive leadership and also about his career as a citizen leader. Our agenda for today, you guys had the chance before we started recording to introduce yourselves briefly. Next, we'll have about 15 minutes to hear from Representative Kaufman about an overview of adaptive leadership and also highlights from his career as a citizen leader. And then we'll make sure to leave 10 minutes for question and answer so that we can hear what you guys want to talk about or questions that you might have before we move forward. We're very lucky to have Representative Kaufman on the call with us. He has served as a member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives since 1995. He currently chairs the Legislators Committee on Revenue and is part of the House leadership team. He is a founding president of the Beacon Leadership Collaborative, and he's taught and consulted on public and nonprofit sector leadership for the past 3 decades. He helped launch the Initiative for Diversity and Civic Leadership, served on the National Conference of State Legislatures Leadership Development Faculty, and was the founding director of Northeastern University's Center for Leadership and Public Life, and has a number of other roles where he's been able to really focus on enacting what leadership means and helping others learn about that. So with our focus on fostering the next generation of citizen leaders, we're especially thrilled to hear from you today, Jay. So thank you. I will turn things over to you.
Well, Susie, thank you so much. And thank you all to the rest of you as well. I'm planning this as a conversation, not as a lecture. So please interrupt whenever you're moved to do so. I'll probably interrupt myself a couple of times, but even before launching into what I had thought to say, I just want to react to a couple of things I heard in the introductions that you folks just did. One is, Dan in particular, I'm interested in a conversation probably offline with you about the Boston Foundation, since I have in mind a major role for the Boston Foundation in Beacon Leadership Collaborative, which is the new nonprofit that I'm just in the process of launching right now. The goal is to have some place where people who are active in the public square or would like to be active in the public square can go to pick up some leadership skills, because to the best of my knowledge, there's nothing like that around, with the single exception of something called the Kansas Leadership Center in Wichita, which is a long ways from here. And it was set up only to serve folks from Kansas. So more about that if you have specific questions, but Dan, I'd love to figure out some way to be in touch.
Yeah, I'm happy to
hear a little bit more about what you're doing at the foundation, let you know what my fantasies are for a partnership with the foundation. And then Bria, I think you mentioned sort of what I took to mean the sense of continuing education, continuing learning. And I think that's an essential piece of leadership. You never know enough. So even the most experienced of people have more experience than somebody less experienced, but they don't know enough. And one of the real challenges, and part of what I like about adaptive leadership is just it really honors and highlights this challenge, is keeping yourself on the edge at all times. The minute you start to think you know enough is when you start getting in trouble. And when you stop identifying with the people around you who know they don't know enough. So I honor you for your openness about that. And I think that probably the most natural thing to do, especially starting out in a career, is feel a little bit insecure about what you don't know. I guess I encourage you to keep that feeling of insecurity. It's not something that just novices feel. It's something that all of us are will to feel until we're ready to give it up. And hopefully we're never ready to quite give it up. And then a couple of you mentioned national service, and I wanted to introduce a bill this term. I knew this was going to be my last term in the legislature. So I was willing to do some things that I knew were real high flyers, not likely to go anywhere, but likely to be good conversation starters for the future. And one of the bills that I had planned to introduce was mandatory public service for every citizen in Massachusetts. And in exchange for that, hopefully some access to some funding for college and the like, or graduate work. But it seems to me that the whole purpose of public education is to train us as citizens and activists, active citizens, active and engaged citizens. Well, hopefully informed and active and engaged citizens. And yet there's nothing that reinforces that. And we say, we talk a good game, but we don't actually practice it. And certainly when I was growing up, there was mandatory military service, and I wouldn't want to go back to that. But the idea of some kind of mandatory service for all of us so that we have experience of being citizens in an active kind of way and get to practice some of the skills that are required of good citizens, I think that would be wholly in order. I ultimately ran out of time trying to figure out how to do that. So I did what all legislators do when they don't know the answer. They set up I proposed to set up a commission to look at the question. Even that is a stretch. A lot of pushback because, oh my God, who's going to pay for this? How are we going to do it? How do you measure efficacy? What counts for public service? What doesn't? It's just a myriad of questions that come up that are enough to shut down conversation. I welcome a long list of questions like that. And hopefully I will leave behind the challenge to my successor and his or her colleagues to stay on this. So I think the fact that we're having this conversation both in state here and nationally, I think is really important. And I'm certainly hopeful that President Obama is going to follow through on his commitment to doing something about this as part of his ongoing attempt to establish a legacy. Okay, all of that interrupted what I was going to say. So this is by way of inviting your interruptions as well. A couple things about my background first. I'm son of immigrants, which has played a major role in who I am. If for no, by the way, the cockatiel that you're hearing in the background, his name is Scotus. He came to this household through my son, who was in law school at the time. So his name is not the Supreme Court of the United States, but Supreme Cockatiel of the United States, Scotus. So we'll just, if it's very annoying, let me know. I can close the door, but I'm ignoring him. Anyway, son of immigrants. So I grew up with this sense of this country having, well, it literally saved my parents' lives when they left Nazi Germany very late in the game. So I grew up with a sense of idealism about this country and what it represented. But I came of, really, I came of age in the 60s, started Brandeis in 1964, at a time when the civil rights movement was certainly very hot and getting even hotter. The anti-war movement in reaction to the war in Vietnam was enormous. And there was enough evidence around me that I was not living in an ideal society. And I, quite frankly, didn't know what to do with that, with all of that. And I think it has left me with a mix of youthful and patriotic idealism and very deep-seated anger and disappointment with how far we are off the mark. And I think that animates a lot of what I do. It animates who I am. When I think of where I'm from, it's more when I'm from, which is the 60s, when we all knew that we shall overcome. That was not a vision, that was an affirmation of reality. The musical Hair identified the period as the dawning of the age of Aquarius. This was going to be, love and understanding and all the rest. Well, maybe someday, but it didn't happen in the 60s. And it has left me with this ongoing quest to sort out how to balance what continues to be a real sense of what we can be with a sense of what we are not. That's very much at the heart of who I was as an undergraduate at Brandeis. I started what was then called the Student Educational Policies Committee, and we were very involved in major reforms of education programming at the school. We started the course curriculum, student involvement in tenure decisions, the 4-course load. We had a 5-course load when I started. We moved to a 4-course load. We set up the independent studies program, the independent major program, a whole bunch of things that were breakthrough at the time, but that seemed just like common sense things to do to fix things that weren't quite right. Then ran, many years later, ran for town meeting in Lexington, where my family moved. At that point, I was interested in getting involved here politically, having been completely turned off to politics as a result of the violence, really, of the late 60s. And I actually left the country for a while just because I just couldn't stand it anymore. So I worked in Europe and then came home committed to being, oh my, all right, SCOTUS, we hear you. Committed to being disengaged. And then when I had kids, I had to engage because it was their lives and their education in particular on the line. I will close that door. All right, SCOTUS, you convinced me. I'll talk to you later. Slightly better. And then, in the course of the work I was doing locally, just got more and more interested in statewide issues and was encouraged to run for the state rep seat when it opened up, which I did with some trepidation, quite frankly. But ultimately, I'm very happy that I did. It feels like exactly the right thing for who I am, and at least at that time in my life. And have had at least 3 or 4 different incarnations as a state rep, depending on largely who the Speaker of the House was. And as we all know, chamber leadership, House Speakers, Senate presidents are disproportionately empowered, probably at our peril, but that is the norm. And so every time there was a change of speaker, the rules of the game completely changed, and I had to change with them. And again, I'm happy to respond to any thoughts or questions about that if you have them. But one speaker in particular helped set me on the course that I'm now on. This was Tom Finneran, for those of you who are from Massachusetts. He was the Speaker of the House, and he spelled leadership D-O-M-I-N-A-T-I-O-N. He was not a first among equals. He was just the first, period. And there was nobody after him. The good news about him is that he's probably the brightest of the speakers I've served under. I don't question his notion of doing public good at all. I just have some serious reservations about his leadership style. But I couldn't quite reconcile the fact that that didn't work. And on the other hand, there were some things about him that were very attractive, he's very bright, happy to think outside the box, very direct in his communications. So there were many things about him that worked for me, and many things that fundamentally didn't. So I, again, did what I suppose any smart person who doesn't know what the answer is, I tried to figure out what the questions were, and wound up enrolling in a leadership course at the Kennedy School with Marty Linsky and Ronnie Heifetz, who turned out to be major gurus for me, and then became major partners after I took the program with them. And the experience of being in that course, where I was introduced to adaptive leadership, which we will turn to momentarily, felt like a real homecoming. I was in tears for much of it because I was getting the vocabulary and the intellectual framework to help me understand and be able to talk about stuff that I knew, but didn't know that I knew. I had some intuitions, I had some insights, but it was all a jumble. And the framework of adaptive leadership put all that in context for me and made it work withable and in turn teachable. So I was enormously grateful, was and am enormously grateful for that experience. started working with them, consulting on leadership or working in the leadership education space. But their clients were largely Fortune 500 companies and companies that could pay a lot of money. And that didn't satisfy the piece of me that was a public servant and thought that those of us interested in community leadership, need that skill set every bit as much as somebody making a lot of money. So Beacon Leadership Collaborative, which is now in the process of getting launched, is my answer to what we do about that. I'm setting it up as a nonprofit organization to do the same thing that Cambridge Leadership Associates does, that a lot of leadership consultants do, but do it at a price point that people who are community activists, school committee members, board of selectmen members, city council members, legislators can think about enrolling and think about being able to afford. So that's the vision for Beacon Leadership. Happily have 8 other faculty partners signed up, and we're ready to go. It's now incorporated. I have the nonprofit application completed, and it's in the process of being reviewed. And we're about to launch. And Dan, I'll talk with you more about that at some point if we can. Let me say a little bit about adaptive leadership, and then I'm going to just shut up and see what your questions and thoughts are. There are a couple of fundamental tenets of adaptive leadership that I would put on the table for us. One is that there's a distinction between leadership and authority, and we tend to conflate the two. So in legislatures, the speaker and his or her team are called a leadership team. There's no guarantee we're getting any leadership out of them, but we are getting a lot of authority. In organizations of any sort, there's usually somebody at the head of the pyramid, and he or she, and more often than not he, is an authority figure. But again, there's no guarantee that there's any leadership going on. The coin of the realm for authority is power. And if you're in a leadership position, power only goes so far. You actually need to use influence more than power. And the other distinction that goes along with authority and leadership is between technical and adaptive challenges. So a technical challenge is one where you can readily identify what the problem is. There's somebody with some expertise in that arena that can be brought to bear on the problem, and that expert can solve the problem. You, as the person witnessing the problem, are just a witness. So an example of that might be the US Air flight that wound up in the Hudson River about 10 years or so ago. So it's been made into a movie. You probably know the story, if not from your own experience, then from the movie. The captain of that plane experienced, the engines blew out because the plane flew through a flock of birds that were sucked into the engine, killed the engines, and basically he was the pilot of a glider with no controls over velocity whatsoever. And he managed to land the plane safely in the Hudson River. Everybody got off okay. What he had was an enormously consequential problem, but in the jargon of adaptive leadership, a technical one. And he was the guy with the expert. So he knew what to do. He was a pilot instructor, among other things, and had simulated similar kinds of things with his students over time. Very fortunate for him as well as for his passengers. He brought all of his experience to bear, and the story had a happy outcome. It didn't need to have a happy outcome. That's a blessing here, but nonetheless, it's an example of something where the challenge is technical. There is a readily nameable problem. You can define it. You can go to a textbook to figure out what to do about it. Somebody understands how to do about it, and they fix it. The passengers were just along for the ride. They had no role to play in this whatsoever. At about the same time, 33 miners were trapped below ground in Chile. And they wound up underground for close to 3 months before they were rescued. Their rescue was, again, a technical solution to a technical problem. But the adaptive work that went on there was how they learned to live underground, out of reach of their families, without food for the longest period of time, never knowing whether they were going to be rescued or not. There was no textbook and no authority that could make things work. As a matter of fact, the crew chief quite wisely said, "I'm not the boss here. I can't solve this problem for us. We're going to have to work this out together." And they did. So they managed to create a new order for themselves. Basically, they needed to adapt because they couldn't really figure out exactly what the problem was. No place to turn for a resolution other than inside. So that's the major distinction here. A technical challenge is identifiable and there's some expertise or authority that can be brought to bear. An adaptive challenge is one where none of that is present and you have to be engaged in it. When you think about the kinds of things that we're facing today in the public square, whether it's, well, the latest headlines are about sexual abuse. We can turn to race. We can turn to the wealth and income inequality. We can talk to environmental degradation. All of those things are going to require us to change in order to move beyond those challenges. Nobody's going to do them to us or for us. We have to be part of the solution. And that kind of exercising leadership of that sort is extraordinarily rare. We spend a lot of energy and a lot of time on technical challenges because they're easier to talk about and you have some hope that you can find a resolution of them. When you don't even know how to talk about the problem, it's really hard to exercise leadership. And you need to invite people to a conversation about the unknown. And we're not real good about those conversations. Very often people who try to exercise leadership of that sort wind up marginalized, if not assassinated, at least character assassination, if not physical assassination, because they're inviting us to be uncomfortable. And the role of authorities are more about direction, protection, and order than they are about an invitation to discomfort. So the kind of leadership that I think is important and that I'm encouraging people around me and certainly you to exercise throughout your entire lives is more of the adaptive sort, where you're taking on some of these impossible challenges because somebody's got to do it. Or we don't, we'll wind up no better off than we are right now, which is just not good enough.
Yeah, thank you for those summaries, Jay. I wasn't sure if you wanted to summarize a few more key points, or you just mentioned inviting people into the conversation, or if this was a good time to switch to questions as well.
I just want to mention one last thing, and I'll do it in 30 seconds. The third key piece of the work under the adaptive leadership umbrella is called the immunity to change exercise, where we confront what it is about ourselves individually that has us resistant to change. For all the talk about change being a good thing, when was the last time we made a New Year's resolution that never made it past January 5th or 6th? It's very hard to change things, even when you're committed to it. And there's a psychological dynamic at play here that the immunity to change helps us to discover. And once we do that and begin to have some understanding of our own reactions to and dynamics around change, we can then work with others who all are coming with the same immunity to change and try to change organizations, which also develop an immunity to change. So individually and collectively, we're very slow and very hard to change. But if we're serious about adapting and addressing the major challenges around us, we better figure out how to deal with our own resistance and and then the more collective resistance to change. Now I'm going to shut up.
No, thank you so much, Jay. Didn't mean to have you be quiet. I just wanted to take you up on that invitation for conversation. And
Great.
you know, we have several great fellows on the call. We've also had Brian and Jess join us since we did introductions before, and we wanted to leave a couple minutes for questions or thoughts from you all. So feel free to chat in or just unmute yourself and talk over the line. And some of you are muted by the system. So I'm actually just going to go ahead and unmute everyone and just be aware that everyone's been unmuted.
So if you have birds in the background, we'll hear them too.
Yes. So while you all are thinking
I'm happy to just introduce myself and break the ice for the other fellows because I hopped on late. Hi, Jay. I'm Jess Kent. I'm calling from New York, but live in Los Angeles. And what is actually interesting to me about the reading and what you just spoke about was the third component of like how to prepare that personal process for leaders to model their willingness for change in their own lives and in their own actions, as opposed to merely from a theory or a theoretical perspective or merely from authoritative space in an organization. So I would love to learn a little bit more about that and how you've seen folks go from a place of power and authority to a place of influence and leadership.
Well, I guess the first thing that comes to mind to say about that is maintain some sense of modesty about the power that we supposedly have. It is much bigger in our own minds than in reality. So being aware of the fact that although you may be granted some power by your constituency or your organization, you can overplay that real easily. But the bigger mistake probably is allowing yourself, well, what people do with folks in positions of power is pass all questions and decisions up the food chain. So in an organization that is vibrant and, again, using the jargon, adaptive, the person at the top of the heap, the person in authority, is wise to pass the problems back down to people who need to solve it and not do it for them. This holds true for parents and children. I've seen some remarkable examples. My son and daughter-in-law just had their second child, and they are my models for how to parent. They are incredible. They let their 2.5-year-old, the youngest is only 12 days old, so we haven't seen it yet with him, but their 2.5-year-old does stuff that most parents would be nervous about letting their 2.5-year-old do. So he serves salad at the dinner table. 2/3 of the salad winds up on the floor or on the table and not on the plate. But this is how he's going to learn to serve salad and do other stuff. And they do that. That's just a petty example. So they trust him in ways that most parents don't trust their kids. And I think being in an organization with a staff isn't quite the same as being a parent, because you don't want to be parental about that. But turning an issue, a challenge, an opportunity, a problem back to people to solve themselves rather than doing it for them is one way to say, I don't pretend to know how to do this. Saying I don't know a lot is a good thing to do. It's a little countercultural. It's kind of hard to run for office when somebody asks you a question and say, I don't know, because they expect you to know. That's your job by their standards. So training the people around you, whether it's your partners or your kids or your organization or your community, to be your partners in problem solving is leadership, as I understand it. For those of us that aren't as headstrong as others, it might be slightly easier, but it's not easy. And well, enough about that, I think. Does that ring true to you at all, or tell me what your thoughts are about that?
Yeah, I mean, I recently finished a master's in organizational behavior, and so I'm trying to push this into the knowledge that I have about teamwork and training people through diverse scenarios to actually collaborate together, and how to train or manage folks up into management and leadership roles, oftentimes who really don't see themselves in that space and don't want to be there. So I mean, this is very helpful. Especially the part of like inviting people to become partners in problem solving and saying, I don't know. I think that there's like a cultural shift per se, for the difference between what is good power and what is effective influence in the conversation about leadership versus authority. But I'll leave it open to other folks. I don't know if Brian wants to introduce himself too.
Well, just a couple of quick things about that. First of all, I think just using the vocabulary of leadership and authority is, I think, helpful, because most of us conflate the two. So pointing that out is an invitation to a different level of conversation than you might otherwise have. And then you may need to remind people of that periodically, because we'll fall back on old habits. So that's one suggestion. The other one is the teaching method that they used at the Kennedy School and that I now have learned to use, although it's challenging, is called case in point learning, or case in point teaching, I'm sorry. So rather than using a case that somebody has written up for you, you use what's going on in the room at the time. So if somebody seems to be ceding his or her authority to you, or passing on to you something that's really theirs, just time out. What just went on here? You know, what's your expectation of me here? And what is all that about? So just using what's going on in the moment as a way of stopping action long enough to get a different conversation going.
Thank you, Jess, and thank you, Jay. I want to be conscious of everyone's time, but I also want to see if there are one or two last questions out there. Is there anyone that wanted to share a thought or a question before we go?
This is Marianne in Florida. So I'm just really interested in, learning more about your organization when it kind of takes flight. And so, Susie, if that's something you're able to forward on to us, I think that would be great, since it is, it is an under, there's not enough supply of resources around this topic.
Great, happy to do it. Susan, maybe you can pass on the website to everybody.
Definitely. I think there was a link with your bio and the website in the announcement, but I will send more out after this call.
Okay, so the website is up. Don't claim that it's perfect, and hopefully it'll evolve, but it's there as a good starter anyway. And more than happy to get an email from you if you have a specific question or thought. And criticism.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thanks, Marianne.
And I see some people have chatted in that they have to go in a minute, but really appreciate the call. So I know that we build this as just a brief half-hour check-in and a chance to chat with Jay. I want to put this in the context for everyone of our monthly convenings, that we have another one coming up next month, Leading with Purpose, which will be with New Politics. Focus on their framework for understanding leadership and how to connect more powerfully with your own sense of purpose. All of these virtual convenings are also in the context of our in-person events. Please make sure that everyone is saving the date for our June 8th, 10th anniversary Segal program celebration in Washington, D.C., and our annual Fellows Retreat, June 8th through 10th in Washington, D.C. But most of all with that, I really want to give a huge thank you, Jay, even just hearing a little bit about your own history, your family's history, which you shared, and your own professional history, and the questions that people asked. And Marianne, thanks for asking about Beacon Leadership Collaborative. We will make sure to share. There's a lot of people here who in this state who can't believe that Jay will not be running for office again, but we know he'll be doing many great things with Beacon Leadership Collaborative and with the family and kids and grandkids that he mentioned. So thank you to everyone for sharing your time with us today. With that, I just want to give a huge thanks to you, Jay Kaufman, and I will end the recording, but I'm also going to invite anyone who wants to stay online for a little bit. So
I just thank all of you for participating. I can't believe it's been half an hour already.
Have a wonderful holidays, a wonderful new year. Thank you so much, Jay. Thank you, all you fellows. I'll stop the recording now, but we can also stay online.